Breakfast! Jackson Henry shuffled into the room, wearing his usual attire, a faded plaid bathrobe over a pair of denim overalls. He glowered at the food laid out on the counter, his furry eyebrows nearly touching as he bent over to examine his bagel more closely. "What kind are these?" he growled, picking up his plate and carrying it over to the table. He continued to study the bagel, squinting at it distrustfully. "Cinnamon raisin," James replied, spearing a forkful of egg. "Why?" Jackson sat down at the kitchen table and scraped his chair loudly across the linoleum floor as he moved his thin frame closer to his plate. He began to pick raisins out of his bagel like a petulant child. "I told you, I only like sesame seed," he grumbled, tucking a paper napkin into the neck of his shirt. James sighed. "The store was out of those, Pop. I'll get sesame seed next time." He inhaled the pleasant aroma coming from his own bagel as he lifted it to his mouth. He loved the smell of cinnamon. When James was a boy, his mother would have made homemade cinnamon rolls on a dreary October day. They would be waiting at his place for him, warm and fresh from the oven, with rivulets of icing cascading down their high walls of succulent dough. James would come home from band practice, and Jackson would arrive after a long, satisfying day's work at Henry's Hardware and Supply Company, to be met by the scent of cinnamon filling the entire house. James would drop his instrument case, kiss his mother on the cheek, and sit down at the kitchen table to a delightful treat. It was the small things, like the aroma of cinnamon or the feel of her dented mixing bowls, that made James miss his mother's presence the most. She had died in August, just 2 short months ago, leaving him to care for his father. Physically, Jackson was perfectly healthy, but over the last decade he had become more and more reclusive. After his hardware store was bought out by one of the big chain stores, something in Jackson seemed to wither up and die. He began to leave all of the errands that required a drive into town to his wife. Instead, he'd tinker about in the back shed for most of the day. James's mother complained that her husband barely talked anymore. He came inside for meals, which he rarely finished, and to sit in front of the TV in the evenings. The only programs he'd watch were game shows. He no longer read the newspaper or seemed to have any hobbies. James had always assumed his mother would live to a ripe old age. She was vivacious and full of life, constantly working on some charitable venture or volunteering at the local elementary school. She walked 3 miles every morning and had never smoked a day in her life, so when she had a sudden heart attack in her sleep, James was completely stunned. He was also devastated. Not only had he lost his beloved mother, but he also knew that her passing marked the end of his life as a college professor. He couldn't leave his father to fend for himself, nor did he feel right putting him in a nursing home. James was an only child, and his mother would have wanted him to move back to Quincy's Gap to care for his father. So he did. After reluctantly handing in his resignation to the English department chair, James packed his old Bronco with his belongings, mostly books, and returned the key to his cozy brick townhouse to the rental agency. He took a final walk through the streets of historic Williamsburg, venturing out early in the morning before the crowds arrived, and marveled at how charming it was. Standing on the sidewalk, he tried to capture an image of the trees lining the gravel road leading toward the campus of William and Mary. As the minutes passed, the morning sun set the autumn leaves ablaze, bidding James a fiery farewell. Turning away from the life he'd come to know, he filled up a takeout mug with Sumatra blend at the coffee house, and then drove 4 hours west, to the hometown he only visited during Christmas and summer breaks. Boasting one main street